For a long time, Canada seemed to have a pretty good immigration policy. People from all walks of life supported it. But in the past few years, we've seen a lot of frustration with what's been happening there. Today, we've got an expert who's going to help us unpack the changes that have occurred in Canada's immigration system. And we're going to ask him about some of his recommendations on what needs to change to improve things. Michael Barutciski is a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thank you, Michael, for taking a few minutes to chat today.
Thanks for inviting me, Colin.
I want to start by just asking you about something that I've heard many times over the past few years, and that was that the system used to be really well designed, and that people around the world would look at Canada's system and say, hey, these guys have got it figured out. They've got a system that operates well, and then everything changed and it looks like things have kind of fallen apart. Is that a fair summary from where you sit?
I think it's exactly right. We had a system that a lot of countries were trying to emulate. They were actually copying parts of our system. And I think if we had to put in basic terms, in the last few years, we just had the sheer numbers were just too much. And then I think the way it was done, the lack of transparency, so there's a lot to unpack there. And then I think ultimately we're just being too nice, we're just being too open and too generous, and that leads to a problem of the risk of being naive and maybe leading to abuse. So I think we have to actually figure out that that's what's actually different in the last few years.
No. I want to get your take on something too, because I see sometimes online people just say they're fed up with where we're at. They say, let's just stop all immigration. We don't want any more immigration. And, you know, when I interact with people, I say, well, wait a second. Hey, we got to think about this for a second because we have an aging population. And it's a fact of life that when you get older, you start to require some pretty expensive services from the government, including, especially in the healthcare sector, things like heart operations that can cost, you know, $100,000, hips and knee operations, cancer treatment, and many other procedures, which cost a lot of money. Things that people, when you're younger, you tend not to require as much. So you need that robust workforce that is earning more money and paying lots of taxes. And so if we cut off immigration, then we're really starting to cripple that tax base that's paying for these services. Is that, do you share that view or do you have a different thought on that?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if we made more babies, maybe we'd have a different conversation about immigration. But the reality is, we're at an ultra low natality rates at this point. So we're not going to change that in the next few years. I think it's a good thing that we start thinking about serious population policies. So we have partner countries to look at what they're doing. But that is not going to change. We have been an immigration country since for a couple of centuries, and that will have to continue. We have to just make it intelligent. And what we said at the beginning about looking back, how we did this relatively well a few years ago. So it's about the numbers and then figuring out what categories we're admitting and making the right balance. So we can do this. We just have to we need the immigration. It's just, maybe it's not 500,000 permanent residents. That's permanent residents. We have to distinguish from another group that completely exploded. So it's maybe not 500,000, maybe it's half of that, which is what we had a decade ago. And if we look back in the 1980s, 1990s, better, more reasonable numbers.
Let's talk about this for a second. We've got a little over a minute left before the commercial break, but I think sometimes different categories get blended together, right? You've got immigrants, you've got temporary foreign workers, you've also got refugees. Are there other kind of groups of people that are kind of coming into the country that maybe need to be part of this discussion?
Well, I think we want to sort of have temporary residence is one, and then permanent residence. Those are the two categories we want to focus. They break down into several subcategories. And I think what you're highlighting is that's one of the problems of recent years. We're just talking new Canadians. Everyone is an immigrant. Well, if someone is seeking asylum, if someone's here just temporarily, we might not actually sort of want to integrate them because they may not be here very long. So we want to keep in mind the various categories. And the government in recent years was just calling everyone immigrants or new Canadians, newcomers, and not the same. I think that's part of the problem. We just got too loose with our categories.
Okay. When we come back, I want to continue to pick your brain on sort of the problems and how we fix it. We'll be back after this commercial break. And we're back on 2nd Street talking with Michael Barutciski from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Michael, before the break, we're talking about immigration and how, people, and you agreed with this notion that we used to have a good immigration system, but that the wheels have kind of fallen off. Can you give us an example of maybe 2 or 3 different changes that the government fundamentally made over the past few years that really sort of undid the good system that we had?
Okay, so the main change I think people should focus on is we used to talk about immigrants, and that was landed immigrants or permanent residents people. And so that the whole discussion was around there, and it was 200,000 or so. And I'm talking a decade ago under the Harper government, for example,
Yeah.
and even the decades before that. We're looking at up to around the 200,000. So what happened in the last decade was that 200,000, first of all, we got very ambitious and we're saying that 200, 250,000 will go up to 200, 500,000. So we got quite ambitious about that. So we're actually openly saying that we want more immigrants. Okay, at one level, I'd say that's fine if you're telling people and communicating it clearly. But what we weren't saying is that parallel to that, we had a complete explosion, a new category in a sense, because we didn't have many of them in the past, temporary residents. So a lot of foreign workers and foreign students, a lot, 1 million plus. It got so absurd, I would say, that about 3 years ago, the immigration minister at the time, Sean Fraser, would come out and say, wow, we've just got a record intake this year, 1.5 million immigrants. Wow. Not explaining at all, not even giving hints at, well, that's actually because there's like 1 million temporary residents with these various kinds of statuses that we could all start questioning. So it's just this kind of way of not communicating that at all. So, various businesses and industry, no one can plan for this. All our services, we can't plan for this. If the annual report submitted by the immigration minister is just talking about permanent residents, 250,000. Oh, it's going up to, we'll plan for 450, 500,000. Oh, but we have 1 million others. And then we're presenting as well, 1 million, we've got a lot of immigration. So that was the what I call the lack of transparency, not intelligent in terms of sort of you're being very generous, but you're not informing the population, so they're surprised. And obviously, the backlash, I guess, we've been seeing in recent years is largely because of what I've just explained.
Mhm.
If I could just maybe
It
add,
seems like a crucial error. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
and the fascinating part is we have a lot of specialists on these issues. The media was no one was questioning this 3 years ago. That's the interesting part. So
Yeah.
all our specialists know we have a lot of temporary. And it took a while for even the media to figure out that these numbers don't make sense. We've got other categories that must be in the picture, and we're not talking about them.
Yeah. It seems like a mess when it doesn't seem like the government took proper or took into account where these people are going to be living and what healthcare system are they going to use and what education system and so forth. Because if you already have a strained healthcare system and you're not making sure that enough new doctors and nurses are not only admitted into the country, but seamlessly able to start working in our system, then all you're doing is adding stress to the healthcare system, and you're adding stress to K to 12 schools, often bringing in, children that may not even speak English as a first language. And the housing situation is well known too. If you don't have houses for these people, you end up with huge overcrowding problems with that and that. From what you've seen, was there any analysis by the federal government to make sure that they had those types of social supports in place for these people before inviting them to come on in?
From what I've seen, there was some analysis. What I've seen, and we should also put in there sort of asylum seekers. And what we've done actually is sort of what I think the people around the immigration minister and the prime minister's office were just sort of deliberately saying, well, we'll manage. We'll sort of, so they're ignoring what I think was the departmental warnings. I think there's several clear-cut cases of, so we have a problem of not listening to the specialists who are saying, we're not ready for this. It's maybe all being presented as we're very open, versatile, we're going to have a lot of diversity. We're not thinking about the consequences. And we're not being transparent, because if we have an ideological framework or we want to be as open, fine, that's That's okay if people want that as for their leaders, but then you do actually have to tell the population, the public, other politicians in parliament that this is what you're doing actually, so we can actually have a real debate, which is what I would say we didn't have. And that's one of the problems when we ended up, of course, like you said, sort of housing, services, everything was, we were not planning for this, we weren't prepared. So obviously this is what's much of the backlash.
I think that's a good point. I've read some of the work that you've done on this, and you make that important point about transparency, just making sure everyone knows what's happening. When we come back, I want to talk about solutions. We'll be back after this commercial break. And we're back on 2nd Street talking about fixing Canada's immigration system. Michael, before the break, we were talking about just sort of like the failure of the government to really take into account the social supports that are needed when you invite a whole bunch of people into the country, making sure they have places to live, a healthcare system that can handle increased demand, an education system that can handle it, and other aspects of living in Canada. If we shift now and start to talk about solutions, let's pretend that Mark Carney calls you up tomorrow and says, Michael, look, I need you in my cabinet. We got to fix this immigration issue. What would be the first thing that they need to do that they're not doing right now?
I'd say the first step is to oblige the minister to actually publish more data in the annual reports that the minister is presenting to Parliament. So it would cover much of what we were just talking about, and it would strengthen parliamentary oversight, and the public could have a better debate. So we'd have to have data on temporary residents, which we did not, by law, we do not have to have in the annual report. So that's why we were taken off guard a couple of years ago. There was no data on any of that. We have to identify countries of origin. That, for some reason, it's not an obligation. I would make it an obligation. Explain that what are the countries of origin for? So we're just prepared for integration. Might have specific challenges depending on which countries we're. There'd be more details about asylum claims at the airport, inland from students. Are they entering illegally? What is the asylum? So I would oblige the government to actually, so I'd amend the legislation. So we have an immigration law. I'd amend it Section 94 and actually oblige that we have a modern annual report that is actually giving us the data we need to have an honest and serious discussion. I wouldn't rely on specialists to give us, because some of this data is available online. Government has a lot of stuff that's available, but it's difficult to find. People I see sort of members of parliament, they don't have that kind of data accessible. It's difficult. And if you have the specialists giving us that data, they're interpreting, they're leading it, but there's so many interests in this field that you could imagine that there's a risk of being sort of given data by the specialist who's trying to push for some kind of policy or their own interest that they're defending. So that's what I would do. Oblige that we have a real debate with more data presented in a modernized annual report that is actually addressing 21st century mass migration flows.
Right. Yeah. Before I don't disagree with what you're saying. It just sounds like common sense. Be transparent about the data, allow Parliament to debate the numbers appropriately. When it comes to the numbers themselves, the volume of people that we're inviting into the country, you've talked about the distinction between permanent and non-permanent. What do you think the magic numbers need to look like in terms of how many we're allowing in versus how many we're currently on pace to allow in?
I don't focus on too much on specifics, but I can give you, but I think what the government is actually doing now, they're cutting quite a bit. So for going below 400, going permanent residents, we're talking about permanent residents, so we do need to cut that, and we are cutting them. We do want to keep a lot of immigrants, so permanent. It's the temporary residents that we want to cut quite dramatically, I think. That includes the foreign workers, the different categories of foreign workers, and the foreign students. And the government has actually been cutting quite a bit. So I'm not too worried that future planning is the problem, because the government's signaling the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council's office are quite clear. Hopefully the Immigration Department can implement this. That's what I would be concerned about. Is this actually being implemented and following up monitoring? And there's different ways we can do that, but we have to make sure that we are keeping this sort of smaller number planning that's been laid out by the government for a year now.
Yeah. So is it fair to summarize what you're saying is that you think the government realized the problem that has occurred and they're now trying to get things back? They're on the right track in terms of what they've announced, and that it's a question of whether or not they actually do what they've promised. Is that where we're at?
It's exactly that.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister, as I said, perfectly clear. The Immigration Minister is following instructions, so the statement's all perfectly clear. The department is implementing this. I'm saying that we should just make sure they actually do follow up on uh, these planning levels that they're presenting, and how they present them. We have to be careful about that. So the plan is good at the moment, and they've even amended legislation in the last few days, a few days ago. So those are all part of
Yeah.
bringing the intake numbers down.
Okay. Good. Well, listen, I got lots more questions for you. When we come back, we're going to continue to unpack the immigration issue and how we get things back on the right track. We'll be back in just a moment. And we're back on Second Street, talking about Canada's immigration system and getting it back on the right track. Michael, previously you mentioned this notion of country of origin and making sure that that information is being transparent to our elected officials. I want to ask you about that. My guess is that part of this is making sure that the people that are coming into this country share the values that Canadians have. Is that what you're thinking is behind making sure that that type of data is transparent with our elected officials?
Yeah, I think it's obvious that we want to know where people are coming from, maybe what kind of cultures they're bringing here. That's obvious, and we did that always in the annual reports until just a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Then the minister at the time, so this is Mark Miller, decides not to include that kind of state. That's interesting that we decide not to. We knew for years that we had is China, Philippines, and India, and in various orders. But those three countries for many years were the top intake source countries for permanent residents, because we only had data that we're putting in the annual report for permanent residents, landed immigrants. But we should include that kind of information for all migrants who are coming in, whether they're permanent or temporary.
Right. Why would they stop collecting that data and sharing it with our elected officials?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've tried to raise it, I think maybe a little bit in the Globe and Mail, maybe in the Ottawa Citizen, a few, just to push that discussion. That's what I was referring to before. Let's have honest debates about this. First of all, it'd be good for the minister to actually address that. So we don't know. So that's the real answer is we don't know, because the minister won't tell us the government. Why would you give data on source countries and then stop? So if I were to speculate, I would say that if maybe there has been in the last few years sort of a new worldview, sort of doesn't matter where you come from, we're sort of, we're going to integrate all cultures, everything is compatible. And obviously that's a very debatable proposition. So I think that's that awkward debate that's lurking in the background here, and we're just too afraid to actually discuss this. And that's what I worry about. That's why I say we need to actually have honest debates without the risks that you raise a question, you're automatically a xenophobe or racist. No, we're raising questions and want immigration or a pro-immigration country. That's obvious. We will need a certain amount. We're just discussing. Is it 300,000, 400,000, 200,000 permanent residents? How many temporary residents do we want parallel to that? Historically, we just have a few thousand. Then we go up to 1 million. We have almost 3 million, a little less than three temporary residents with expiring visas. Okay, well, those numbers are those people even going to leave? Because we were sort of implying that they may actually transition to permanent resident status. So we're not having those debates. We're starting to now, and this is, I think, part of the process. What you're doing, you've brought up these kinds of issues. So I can see for at least a year or more from the previous shows that I've been able to see.
Oh, good. Well, listen, I think it's an important issue for Canadians. As we talked about, we need immigration to support our, the benefits and that governments have committed to people. We don't have enough people working, so we got to do something, and we're not having enough babies. So we got to make sure we get this mix right and make sure we get immigration right. Um, we've got about a minute left. I want to ask you. I know this is a big question, but are we doing enough when it comes to screening of people that are coming into this country to make sure that they don't have criminal records, that their values align with Canadians, that they have something to offer in terms of maybe skills that this country needs, those types of things?
I think it's obvious. If you watch some of the parliamentary committee hearings, the witnesses, what they're saying, what the Auditor General was saying just a week ago, I think it's obvious we're very, we don't screen well. We're very lax and very loose. So I think that's part of the problem we're discussing. So many, too many high numbers in various categories. Behind that is this attitude of just being very, very flexible, loose, and obviously that is leading to the potential problem is abuse. So it's obvious we need to tighten the rules and to think a little bit more seriously about enforcement. No one wants to talk about those kinds of issues because we present immigration as sort of it's how open we are. We actually have to. So immigration isn't about being anti-racist. No, immigration is about thinking strategically of the future of this country.
Well, listen, you've given us a lot of good information and insight today. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me, Colin.
Well, there you have it. It's obviously important to make sure we get immigration right as a country, and it certainly seems like things went off the rails. We'd love to know what you think about this conversation. What do we need to change when it comes to immigration? Are we on the right track with getting things back in order? Love to hear your feedback. You can send us an email. As always, thanks for watching.